Once it was a part of Russian territory. There are still reminders to this day. Children wearing Russian national costumes, people having Russian names, and many Orthodox churches standing here. But more than 140 years ago, it became the U.S. territory, though some Americans still don't know about it.
Discovered Alaska?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
About Alaska, like nothing.
I don't know anything about that.
Alaska? It's cold.
It was called a box of ice, a polar bear garden, and Walrussia. But in the language of the indigenous peoples, the word Alaska means the Great Land. Sven Håkansson is steering his boat out of the narrow bay of Kodiak Island. His ancestors have lived here since time immemorial. Over the thousands of years, they too saw this seascape each time they put out to sea to hunt. But they used narrow canoes with a couple of paddles instead of comfortable motorboats with powerful engines.
In the past, yes, it was very, very difficult to hunt as an individual. You need to hunt as a group in order to actually capture, for example, you look at the sea lions over here. In order for you to hunt one of those, you'll need several people.
On a summer day in 1741, scores of Aleuts, the natives of the land, set out on a hunting expedition in canoes. They spotted odd-looking ships on the horizon. Those big sailboats belonged to an expedition led by Russian explorers Bering and Chirikov. That was how Kodiak Island made its appearance on Russian maps. The first colonists were guided by those maps when they landed on the island more than 40 years later in 1784. The city of Kodiak was the capital of Russian America for 15 years. Kodiak's streets serve as a reminder of that time. Many of them still bear the names of Russian travelers and merchants.
There's the street name Shelikov, who founded, with his wife, Natalia, the very first Russian permanent settlement in Alaska. And then there's Shelikov's son-in-law, Rozanov, named after Nikolai Rozanov, who was representing the government of Russia and also the Russian-American Company.
The Russian-American Company was founded in 1799. It dealt primarily with the hunting and selling of sea otters, which dwelled in large colonies on the Alaskan coast. This building was used as a warehouse. From here, the fur went to Russia and China.
This sea otter pelt has the thickest fur of any animal, the most furs per square inch. This is the animal itself, the sea otter. This animal was what caused the fur gold rush to Alaska by Russia.
Russian traveler Mikhail Malakhov first came to Alaska in 2009. He organized an expedition to retrace the steps of his fellow countryman Lavrenti Zagoskin. Zagoskin was the first ever European to reach Alaska's hinterland. He mapped this unexplored land and established contact with the Aboriginal people. Local people welcomed Malakhov warmly, just as their ancestors welcomed Zagoskin 250 years ago. Their homes may have changed a lot, but their attitude to Russians remains the same.
Clearly, we were welcome there, at least in the places that had once served as bases of the Zagoskin expedition. Whenever we told them we were Russians, many of the local people said they had Russian ancestors.
When the Russians came to Alaska, the lives of the indigenous people changed. Many of them began to work for the Russian-American Company. Jobs involved hunting for sea otters, fishing, and taking part in the building of new settlements. Russian priests and monks visited Alaska and baptized the locals into the Orthodox faith. Russian men married local girls.
Russian men married local women, and their children were called Creoles. Some Creoles were well educated. They held top posts in the Russian capital, as well as in the colonial administration in Alaska.
Sven Håkansson lives a life entirely different from his ancestors. To him, putting out to sea is more like fun than work. Sven is proud of his traditional bathhouse. He sees it as a symbol of successive generations and embedded Russian traditions.
When the Russians came, the thing that is similar are the rocks and the heat and the steaming, the washing inside the banya. And that's something that we've been doing for centuries, and it's a tradition where now we have a wooden house, which is a Russian banya. We've just adapted to it. And I mean, I grew up taking banyas for baths.
Sven sees telling the history of his people as a mission. He curates a museum, which is one of the principal tourist attractions of Kodiak Island. When few tourists visit it during low season, local people come here too.
When the Russians actually took over or claimed Alaska for Russia.
Spiridon Semyonov, one of Sven's friends, together with his family, is listening to his story. Although his name is of Russian origin, he doesn't know a single word of the language spoken on the other side of the Bering Strait. Nor does he know much about where his last name comes from.
Everything I tell you is what my mom told me. She said when the Russians were here, they were taking people off to go hunting, and they were hunting sea otters and everything. And they couldn't say our last name, so they gave us Russian names.
Spiridon Semyonov doesn't need to speak Russian. All services in the Orthodox Church in Kodiak City are held in English. Father Innokenty was born in New England, a place that is far away from here. He has no Russian roots. Nevertheless, he decided to serve as an Orthodox priest in Alaska. But it was a long story.
It's a story of growing up in a Christian church, a Protestant church, but always wanting and seeking out a fuller faith, a fuller experience of the faith, and finding that in Orthodoxy as a young man, and eventually answering the calling to the priesthood. So.
The church where Father Innokenty serves stands where the first church in the New World used to be. Alaska is still predominantly Orthodox U.S. state.
Russians and the priests that then came didn't force us to not speak our language. They didn't force us to not follow our traditional ways of living. We did, stop practicing our older religious practices, but pretty much everything else stayed the same. Hunting, language, but then during the American period, when the Americans came, they wanted to civilize us.
American archaeologist David McMahon is exploring the remains of Russian legacy on Alaska.
These are lead seals. They would have been used by employees of the Russian-American company to put around bales of fur.
This is one of the most important finds of his career. Some of the objects were found at the site of the first Russian settlements, others on the ocean floor.
So these are interesting. This is probably one of the ship's frames.
Together with Russian colleague Yevgenia Anishchenko, David McMahon raised many remains of the Russian ship Kodiak from the depths of the ocean. The ship belonging to the Russian-American company sank near the shores of Kodiak Island in 1860.
The ice trade was very lucrative because the gold miners in California needed ice for their drinks. So even if half of it melted, they would still make a good profit. The ship was leaving Kodiak and it hit a rock. Everyone got off the ship, but because of the ice on board, the ship stayed afloat for several days before it finally sank.
The archaeologists dived 25 meters deep to explore the remains of the ship. The Kodiak was one of a dozen ships keeping the lines of communication with Russia open. Similar ships regularly sailed the length of the North Pacific. Many saw the shipwreck as a symbol the Russian-American company was in dire straits. At the beginning of the 1860s, the company reached the edge of bankruptcy. That caused a debate on whether Alaska could be sold. The vast territory was inhabited by 800 colonists at the very most. This number was well below what Russia needed to control and defend it.
Those factors led to a serious discussion about a potential sale. They were held in an atmosphere of secrecy. Only a handful of officials knew about them.
America was not particularly keen on buying the faraway territory. The Russian envoy to Washington, Eduard Stekel, was told to do his best to convince the U.S. government that it would gain enormous benefits by acquiring Alaska. Stekel had the support of U.S. State Secretary William Seward, who was in favor of U.S. territorial expansion. Finally, in 1867, after lengthy negotiations, Alaska was sold to the United States for the price of $7.2 million. On October the 18th, 1867, the Russian flag was lowered in the former Alaskan capital of Sitka. In its stead, America's colors were raised. Today, Happy Alaska Day is one of the major holidays of the 49th state. During the bright show, the residents of Sitka reenact the procedure of handing over the flag from Russians to Americans. In 1867, the ceremony for placing the Russian colony under U.S. control was much more modest. The American government was weary of accusations that they had wasted a lot of money. Headlines splashed across newspapers scoffed at the purchase, describing it as nothing more than a box of ice. Rumor even had it that of the $7.2 million paid, some $200,000 was given to senators in the form of kickbacks.
Deliberate steps were taken in the hope of swaying some senators towards a hitch-free ratification of the treaty.
After Alaska came under U.S. control, the Russian-American company lost its influence and the Russian settlers were offered a choice, either return to Russia or live in the reservation-like settlement of Ninilchik. What became of the money earned in the Alaska deal was shrouded in mystery. The official version claimed that the whole payment reached Russia and was spent on the construction of railways. Rumors persisted, however, that the ship carrying the gold received for the sale of Alaska had sunk in the Pacific.
North to Alaska, go north for Russia's home. North to Alaska, go north to Russia's home.
Gary Askolkoff was born and raised in Alaska. Like many Alaskans, he refers to other states as the lower 48. Gary is sure that Americans have a poor impression of the 49th.
Most people in the lower 48 don't know that Alaska is part of America. Some believe that it's still tied to Russia, but many believe that it's its own country, and they wonder what kind of money they're going to have to use when they're here and what language we speak and those kind of things. I've actually had people compliment me on, you sound just like an American.
Gary Askolkoff has lived in the small settlement of Ninilchik on the Kenai Peninsula since birth. There are more than 20 Askolkoffs here. His grandfather knew only a few English words. Gary, however, doesn't speak Russian.
My grandfather passed away a couple of decades ago, and my grandmother, Mariska Zoya, passed away soon after that. Just some distance from here, my father's buried, and most of my relatives, and one day I will be too.
Right after the peninsula was sold to the Americans, the village Ninilchik was built on the seashore. All of the employees of the Russian-American company who refused to move to Russia had been banished here by the U.S. government.
One of the older buildings is right down below us, doesn't have a window in it, and it's built in the old log dovetail design with the dovetail corners. There are several other buildings that are throughout here, including sheds that were used for fishing. The older ones were built as old as the late 1800s.
All the residents of Ninilchik are related to each other one way or another.
That's your grandma. This is Irene. She died in 1985.
One of the most successful people born in Ninilchik is Loren Lehman, who is a distant relative of Gary Askolkov. 4 years ago, he was the lieutenant governor of Alaska. He is only passing through today. Loren has decided to stay with his uncle and aunt. Their ancestors were Russians, and they still use Russian words in their everyday lexicon.
Очень красивая девочка? No, when she's married. What's the word? Девочка?
A few hours later, he will visit his father at a nursing home in the town of Soldotna.
Я люблю тебя. I tell my father that every time. Oh, I love you too.
Loren Lehman doesn't see the Russian heritage simply as a distant episode in the history of his native state. He remembers well that when he was a child, far more people spoke Russian than English.
I've talked about that with my brothers, about the Russian heritage, and we often have kind of joked about it, and when we get within about 10 miles of Ninilchik, we're doing what we call speaking Ninilchik. We start talking like my father talked, telling some of the stories. It is still a very big part of my heritage.
Loren arrives at Soldotna around lunchtime. He visits his father at the local nursing home. He says a few phrases in Russian.
Это мой отец, Николай. Познакомьтесь, пожалуйста.
Nick Lehman can't remember names and faces clearly. Last year, he had a stroke.
Как меня зовут?
Joseph Lehman.
No, that's my son.
Nick Lehman's condition sometimes makes him imagine he is not at Soldotna's nursing home, but in the old settlement of Ninilchik, where everyone has a boat, where Christmas is celebrated in early January rather than in December, and where people in nearly every home speak Russian.
Монах рожден, чтобы молиться, солдат, что вечером воевать, чиновник, чтобы с бумагой мириться, а мужик, что вечером работать.
Nick Lehman is one of the few people here who still remember the Russian era of the land. Its former legacy is gradually being forgotten, much in the same way as old people's memories fade away.
I'd like to teach my children about their heritage. We've shared it. It's caught on, especially with our oldest child, our son. And I think the best way we can do it is to talk about it, share some of the stories, maybe even some of the language. I want them to understand our very rich cultural heritage.
You said Nick's going to take over math? Okay. And,
Grigory Weisenberg is one of the most popular teachers at Soldotna High School. Grigory used to teach English to Russian children in the Russian town of Magadan. Today, he teaches Russian in Alaska. None of the children in his class has a Slavic name. All of them are Americans who've decided to learn the language that was once dominant in this part of the world.
You're volunteering, Brianna. Why not? You're volunteering. Давай. Говори.
Okay. Желаю вам свести, расти, копить, крепить здоровье. Оно для дальнего пути главнейшее условие.
Grigory sees himself as a representative of the new wave of Russian settlers of Alaska. Here, he makes himself at home. The Russian legacy is everywhere.
Today, there are at least about 700 names, place names, on the map of Alaska that are conspicuously Russian. For example, Redoubt from Redut, Seldovia from Seldevaya, then the presence of the churches here. So in other words, let's put it like this. Here in Alaska, we live in the presence of the past.
Nikolaevsk is another Russian enclave in Alaska. It emerged here 100 years after the sale of the peninsula. Its 400 inhabitants tried to stick to a lifestyle reminiscent of Siberia rather than America.
People first came here in 1968. This is the first house they built.
Hey, why are they filming you? You're not young enough.
They've chosen an old woman for some reason. Try to guess why.
There's no escape from you. Dressed to kill.
Nina Fafielova is famous in Nikolaevsk, and she is known for causing a stir. Locals are not particularly fond of her because she is the only settler who's always ready to talk to journalists. The reason is that old believers live in this settlement, and they always prefer a reclusive lifestyle. The founders of Nikolaevsk fled the Soviet Union to America to escape persecution on religious grounds. In Alaska, the old believers tried to distance themselves from civilization, much like they would do in Russia.
Initially, it was a private village, no doubt about that. But the signs have been removed, and now people can visit us. They can talk to us and meet others.
Nikolaevsk is no longer a closed settlement. Today it is even something of a tourist attraction. The cafe run by Nina Fafielova is the most lucrative business in the settlement.
Okay, this is my Russian tea. Please take very careful.
For 3 decades, it never occurred to the old believers that someday Americans might be among their neighbors. They tried to escape visiting other towns, but now the American houses stay near the Russian ones.
What are you doing now?
Matthew has 5 children. He moved to Nikolaevsk 7 years ago after buying 1/3 of the local land. His American dream is slowly becoming a reality.
The land was pretty good price. The Russians, I shouldn't say Russians, the people that are here, the Orthodox, they have a nice set of values.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Nina Fafielova maintains friendly relations with Matt. But as the years go by, she becomes ever more apprehensive of the prospect of Nikolaevsk losing its status as a Russian enclave and turning into just another quiet settlement in Alaska. Children in the settlement still wear Russian national dress, but English is now their mother tongue.
We're growing up in a Russian village, but we go to an English school that learn English and not as much Russian. I think over the time, our church is gonna probably go more Americanized.
With faith, I believe that I am Slavonic, but with language, I'm American already.
The new wave of settlers who moved to Alaska during the last decades came from Siberia. 20th century Russian destinations changed in comparison with the 18th century. The majority preferred Alaska's largest city, Anchorage, rather than Kodiak Island or the Kenai Peninsula. Out of the city's 300,000 strong population, 5,000 are migrants from Russia.
There's a place where everybody's going to.
This funk group is rehearsing in a garage situated in an Anchorage suburb. The soloist is the youngest of the band. Everybody calls him Leo. His perfect English hides his true origin. He was born in the Siberian town of Magadan.
The children of the Russians who came here in 1989 or in the early 1990s are about 20 years old now. This Russian generation has grown up in Alaska. They speak very good English and understand spoken Russian. It is indeed a new generation.
One of the songs of the Grinberg group says, "There's a place where everybody's going to. It's the place to be." Actually, an entirely different place is meant in the song, but the new Russian settlers have taken the hymn-like lines close to the heart.
Everybody got to get in, it's so loud. Gotta get in, everybody gotta get in.
Russians don't see themselves as masters of Alaska. They see themselves as guests. Mikhail Malakhov, the traveler, is among them. He and his friends are embarking on a second expedition to the peninsula's hinterland. Once again, they will retrace the steps of early Russian explorers. Mikhail Malakhov's team will have to go through a strenuous course of training before the second expedition. They intend to use the same gear that the early Russian explorers had. No motorboats, only canoes.
Since we're repeating the historical route of the Alaskan discoverer Lavrentiy Zagoskin, then we want to know the actual truth, and that's why we didn't have a choice of transport means.
Sven Haakonsen, head of the community of indigenous people living in Kodiak Island, takes a dim view of the desire of Europeans to make their lives more difficult. His ancestors used to put out to sea in canoes. He prefers motorboats. Sven thinks giving up the perks of civilization is a foolish thing to do. Yet despite embracing the modern era, inwardly he still remains committed to the simple principles preached by his ancestors.
We were here for thousands of years, but we didn't have this system of paper saying that we can claim this land, because in our philosophy, in our worldview, you can't own land. Land owns you. How can you say you own that when you're only here for a little bit and then you're gone? It's a whole different philosophy of owning it versus living with it.